Deep in the tangled wetlands of Virginia and North Carolina lies a place once feared and avoided, the Great Dismal Swamp. To outsiders, it was a nightmare. Endless marshes, clouds of mosquitoes, snakes lurking in dark waters, and terrain so unforgiving that even soldiers and surveyors hesitated to enter. But for those fleeing chains, it was not a place of terror, it was a place of hope. Here, among the dense cypress trees and shifting bogs, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children vanished from the slave South. They were called Maroons, people who escaped bondage and built hidden communities in places deemed unlivable. In the Great Dismal Swamp, they carved out a new existence, building huts on elevated ground, cultivating secret gardens, fishing and hunting, and creating a society beyond the reach of overseers and auction blocks. For centuries, this hidden kingdom endured. Generations were born and raised in the swamp, free but always vigilant, living in a world where survival itself was resistance. While planters and traders looked upon the swamp as worthless, within it thrived one of America's boldest experiments in freedom. And yet, history has nearly erased their story. Who were these people who dared to vanish into the swamp? How did they survive against impossible odds? And what does their hidden world reveal about the will to resist slavery? This is the forgotten history of the Great Dismal Swamp, America's hidden Maroon kingdom. At first glance, the Great Dismal Swamp appears inhospitable, a vast wilderness stretching across Virginia and North Carolina where thick cypress trees rise from dark waters and the air hums with mosquitoes. The very name Dismal was given by European settlers who saw it as a place of misery and danger, an environment too harsh to tame. Yet, for the enslaved, hunted, and oppressed, this hostile terrain was transformed into a refuge, a fortress of freedom carved out of the very land others feared. The swamp was immense, once covering over 1 million acres. Its dense vegetation, shifting bogs, and waterlogged soil created a natural barrier that deterred pursuers. Slave catchers with their dogs and weapons found the swamp a nightmare. Trails vanished into the muck, and danger lurked at every step. For those fleeing bondage, however, those very obstacles were blessings. The swamp was not empty, it was alive with possibility. Here, the environment itself became an ally. Tall cypress trees provided wood for shelter. Wild plants and berries could be gathered. Fish, turtles, and game offered sustenance. Elevated patches of dry land, known as islands, became the hidden foundations of entire communities. To outsiders, the swamp seemed impenetrable, but to those who learned its rhythms, it became a shield against capture. The swamp's isolation was its greatest strength. Planters feared it, slave patrols avoided it, and surveyors often exaggerated its dangers. But for men, women, and children escaping chains, the deeper they went, the safer they were. The swamp was more than geography. It was a silent partner in resistance. This paradox, a place described as unlivable by outsiders but livable enough for generations of Maroons, sets the stage for one of America's most extraordinary stories of hidden survival. The Great Dismal Swamp was not dismal for all. For those seeking freedom, it was sacred ground. The Great Dismal Swamp became a sanctuary, but it was more than a hiding place. It was the birthplace of entire communities built by people who refused to be defined by slavery. These men and women were known as Maroons, a name given to those who escaped bondage and established free settlements in remote or inhospitable terrain. Across the Americas, from Jamaica's Blue Mountains to the forests of Suriname, Maroon societies thrived, and the swamp was America's version of this global resistance. The first Maroons likely reached the Great Dismal Swamp in the early 1600s, as English colonists began importing enslaved Africans. Early escapees included not only Africans, but also indigenous people displaced from their lands. Together, they found common cause in resisting colonial expansion and enslavement. The swamp, stretching over 1 million acres, was the perfect refuge, its dense wetlands too difficult for colonial militias to penetrate. As the centuries passed, the trickle of runaways became a steady flow. Families, individuals, and even groups fleeing together sought sanctuary in the swamp's interior. Some stayed only temporarily, hiding until danger passed. But many settled for years, even lifetimes. Archaeologists have discovered remnants of cabins, pottery, tools, and agricultural plots that testify to the permanence of these communities. The Maroons of the swamp were not aimless wanderers, they were builders. They constructed shelters on dry islands deep within the wetlands, raised children, and cultivated hidden gardens of corn, beans, and squash. Oral traditions suggest they also maintained African cultural practices, carrying memories of home into this new environment. The swamp became not just a refuge, but a cultural bridge, preserving fragments of identities stolen by slavery. For the enslaved who reached the swamp, the act of escape itself was profound resistance. To vanish into a world designed to kill outsiders was to declare survival as rebellion. By founding communities, the Maroons proved that life outside slavery was possible. They did not wait for emancipation, nor for politicians to debate their humanity. They seized it in the shadows of the cypress trees. These hidden communities, born in secrecy, thrived in defiance. They remind us that freedom was not always granted from above, but often claimed from below, in places where the world thought survival was impossible. Life in the Great Dismal Swamp was harsh, but for the Maroons who made it their home, hardship was better than bondage. Here, in the shadows of towering cypress trees and endless wetlands, they built a world that outsiders said could not exist. It was not an easy life, but it was a chosen one, and in that choice lay the essence of freedom. Survival began with shelter. On small patches of elevated land, known as islands, Maroons built cabins from cypress and cedar. Roofs were thatched with reeds and bark, walls sealed with clay to withstand storms. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of these dwellings, modest structures, but evidence of permanence. These were not temporary camps, they were homes. Food came from ingenuity. Hidden gardens supplied corn, beans, and squash, while the swamp itself offered wild plants, berries, fish, turtles, and game. Men and women became expert hunters and foragers, learning the swamp's cycles. Every meal was both sustenance and a victory against a system that declared them property. Community thrived in secrecy. Families raised children who grew up knowing no master's whip. Elders passed down knowledge of survival, stories of Africa, and lessons of resilience. Songs echoed softly under the canopy, blending African rhythms with whispered prayers. Even in hiding, culture survived. Contact with the outside world was rare, but not absent. Some Maroons traded with poor whites, free black people, or even sympathetic workers from nearby canals, exchanging game, herbs, or timber for tools, salt, or cloth. These exchanges were dangerous. Betrayal could mean capture, but they were lifelines that tied swamp life to the world beyond. Fear was constant. Patrols sometimes entered the swamp's edges, dogs barking in pursuit. The threat of discovery never vanished, yet the swamp itself was the best protector. To outsiders, it was endless confusion, biting insects, waterlogged paths, and sudden sinkholes. For the Maroons, it was familiar ground, a landscape mastered. Living in the shadows demanded sacrifice. Isolation cut them off from broader communities. Illness, injury, or storms could devastate entire families. Yet, even with these hardships, the swamp offered something slavery never could: autonomy. For centuries, the Maroons endured. Their lives were not marked in ledgers or censuses, but in whispered stories, fragments of pottery, and hidden garden plots. Theirs was an existence unseen by history books, yet one that defied slavery's power in the most profound way, by simply living free. If survival in the Great Dismal Swamp was an act of resistance, then raising families there was a declaration of permanence. To live free was one thing, but to bring children into a hidden world and to pass on culture and identity was something far greater. It was the creation of a community that slavery could not erase. Families in the swamp faced unique challenges. Every day was a struggle for food, shelter, and safety. Yet, even in these conditions, children were born, raised, and taught the values of resilience and freedom. Unlike on plantations, where families were constantly torn apart by sale and separation, in the swamp, children grew up knowing their parents, elders, and kin. This stability, fragile as it was, gave them something most enslaved children never experienced: a sense of belonging. Culture thrived in whispers and rituals. Oral storytelling became the backbone of education, Elders passed down tales of Africa, myths of trickster heroes, and stories of survival that doubled as lessons for daily life. Songs and rhythms, muted to avoid detection, still carried echoes of African traditions and blended with Christian hymns in ways that preserved both faith and identity. Spiritual life was powerful. The swamp itself was seen as sacred, a place where the natural and spiritual worlds intertwined. Rivers, trees, and hidden clearings became spaces for prayer, ceremonies, and quiet reflection. For many, faith was not just a belief system, but a shield against despair. Identity within these communities was shaped by both memory and adaptation. Maroons carried with them fragments of African cultures, mixing them with new traditions born of swamp life. They created a hybrid identity, neither enslaved nor entirely free in the conventional sense, but something unique, a people defined by resistance. What made these communities extraordinary was not just their survival, but their humanity. They did not merely endure, they celebrated births, mourned losses, laughed, prayed, and loved. They carved dignity out of a landscape the outside world had written off as unlivable. In the Great Dismal Swamp, freedom was not only about escape, it was about building a life worth living. Families, culture, and identity transformed the swamp from a refuge into a kingdom, one hidden but no less real than the grand plantations it resisted. The story of the Great Dismal Swamp is often told as one of survival, but survival itself was resistance. Every person who slipped into the swamp and refused to return to the plantation was making a political statement that bondage was not destiny, and freedom was worth any cost. Unlike dramatic uprisings or battlefield victories, the resistance of the Maroons was quiet, persistent, and enduring. Their rebellion lay in their refusal to participate in the system of slavery at all. By disappearing into the swamp, they robbed planters of labor, defied slave catchers, and carved out an existence that proved slavery was not absolute. Acts of resistance took many forms. Some Maroons launched raids on plantations, stealing food, tools, or weapons. Others spread knowledge, guiding more enslaved people into the swamp. At times, Maroons aided fugitives passing through, creating an informal network of resistance that stretched far beyond the swamp itself. But the greatest resistance was simply living free. To cultivate gardens, to fish, to build homes, to raise children outside the reach of overseers, these acts challenged the very logic of slavery. The system depended on the belief that Africans and their descendants could not survive without masters. The Maroons disproved this every single day. Even their invisibility was resistance. Planters and patrols feared the swamp, inventing stories of ghosts and monsters to explain why they avoided it. The Maroons themselves became legends, their very existence a haunting reminder that slavery was never total. For the enslaved who heard whispers of the swamp, its existence was hope. For the enslavers, it was defiance. In this way, every hut, every harvest, every hidden community stood as a monument of rebellion, not carved in stone, but in survival itself. To the Maroons, the Great Dismal Swamp was sanctuary. To planters, overseers, and slave catchers, it was a nightmare. More than a physical landscape, the swamp became a psychological barrier, a place of dread that represented both danger and defeat. Slave catchers dreaded pursuing fugitives into the swamp. Dogs lost the trail in the waterlogged ground, men sank waist-deep in mud, and clouds of mosquitoes drove intruders back. Patrols whispered that the swamp swallowed men whole. To plantation society, the swamp was a void where control ended and freedom began. This fear was not unfounded. Maroon communities often defended themselves with the terrain itself. Knowledge of hidden paths, shallow crossings, and natural cover gave them an advantage over outsiders. Stories spread of patrols ambushed or vanishing inside, never to return. Each tale, whether true or embellished, added to the swamp's aura of menace. Planters came to see the swamp not just as a wilderness, but as an enemy. The knowledge that enslaved people could vanish into it at any time threatened their illusion of control. Every whisper of escape, every rumor of Maroon settlements gnawed at their authority. Over time, the swamp took on a near mythical reputation. Some outsiders described it as haunted, filled with spirits or demons. In reality, those ghosts were communities of the living, thriving beyond bondage. The fear projected onto the swamp reflected the fear of slavery's fragility, that even in the heart of the system, there existed places where freedom was alive. The Great Dismal Swamp was not just a refuge of survival, it was a symbol that terrified the South, proof that slavery could never fully conquer the human will. Though the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp sought isolation, they were never completely cut off. From time to time, the swamp's hidden world brushed against the outside, creating encounters filled with both possibility and danger. Some Maroons established cautious ties with Native Americans. Indigenous peoples had long used the swamp as hunting ground and refuge, and in some cases, they shared knowledge of the land or exchanged goods. Both groups, pushed to the margins by colonial expansion, found in each other a reluctant ally against a common oppressor. Poor whites and outcasts also drifted near the swamp's edge. Timber cutters, canal laborers, and drifters sometimes stumbled into Maroon territory. A few traded willingly, bartering salt, iron, or cloth for game, herbs, or labor. Others betrayed the trust, alerting slave catchers or selling information for reward money. Every contact was a gamble, for outsiders could be lifelines or threats. Perhaps the most dangerous encounters came with slave patrols and bounty hunters. Driven by profit or duty, they ventured into the swamp only to find themselves outmatched by its terrain. Maroons used the land as their shield, vanishing into fog, striking from shadows, or leading pursuers into endless bogs. To survive, they mastered both the art of hiding and the art of confrontation. Encounters with outsiders reveal the delicate balance Maroons walked. Isolation gave them safety, but occasional connections provided the tools and goods they needed to endure. Each interaction was measured carefully, for the cost of trust could be freedom or life itself. These stories show that the swamp was not an impenetrable wall, but a shifting frontier, where the enslaved and the free, the hidden and the visible, sometimes collided. And in those collisions, the Maroons proved once more that survival was not silence, but strategy. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Great Dismal Swamp stood at the crossroads of slavery's collapse. For generations, it had been a hidden kingdom of resistance, but now the war between Union and Confederacy reshaped its role and its meaning. Union soldiers who entered the swamp left behind accounts of what they saw. To them, the swamp was treacherous and confusing, but it was also filled with signs of human life. Cabins, clearings, and even families who had lived beyond the reach of slavery for decades. These encounters revealed what many had long suspected, that the swamp was not empty, but alive with people who had already claimed their freedom. For Maroons, the war was both opportunity and danger. The collapse of Confederate control meant greater chances to emerge from hiding, to join Union lines, or to move into nearby towns where emancipation was taking root. Some guided fugitives through the swamp to freedom, turning their knowledge of hidden paths into lifelines for others. In this way, the swamp became not just a refuge, but a corridor of liberation. Yet the war also brought uncertainty. Soldiers could be allies, but they could also be unpredictable. Communities that had lived unseen for generations now faced exposure. For some, secrecy remained the safest strategy until the fighting ended. By the war's conclusion, the swamp's role as a sanctuary began to fade. With slavery abolished, many Maroons stepped into the open, joining the newly freed population. But their long-hidden presence forced a reckoning. Even before emancipation, freedom had been carved out in America's harshest corners. The Civil War did not create the swamp's legacy. It revealed it. In its depths, the enslaved had already waged their quiet war for freedom long before armies marched and proclamations were signed. With the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, slavery was formally abolished in the United States. For the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp, this moment was both liberation and transformation. The hidden world they had carved out in secrecy was no longer necessary in the same way. Yet, freedom did not erase hardship, nor did it erase the swamp's legacy. Some Maroons left the swamp to join the broader freed communities forming in Virginia and North Carolina. They entered towns and villages where the promise of Reconstruction brought schools, churches, and the fragile beginnings of political participation. For those who had lived in shadows, the chance to step into daylight was a profound change. Others remained tied to the swamp for years, unwilling or unable to leave behind the place that had sheltered generations. Some became laborers in the expanding timber industry, cutting the very cypress and cedar that had once hidden them. The swamp shifted from sanctuary to workplace, from kingdom of fugitives to resource for the modernizing South. Yet the Maroon settlements began to fade. Without the constant flow of runaways, communities dwindled. Stories of their existence slipped into folklore, remembered in whispers rather than written records. To many outsiders, the idea that people had lived in the swamp at all seemed unbelievable. But traces remained. Archaeologists have uncovered pottery shards, cabin foundations, tools, and gardens that reveal lives lived in secrecy. Oral histories passed down among descendants preserve memories of ancestors who vanished into the swamp and never returned. The vanishing of the Maroon kingdom does not diminish its significance. If anything, it deepens its mystery. It reminds us that history is not only what is written in ledgers or decreed in law, but also what is lived in silence, hidden until the world is ready to listen. The Great Dismal Swamp after slavery was no longer a refuge of escape, but its memory remained a monument to the will to be free long before freedom was granted. The story of the Great Dismal Swamp is not just a tale of the past, it is a living legacy that challenges how we understand freedom, resistance, and survival. Though the Maroon communities have vanished, their spirit remains embedded in the land and in the memory of those who honor their courage. Today, historians and archaeologists continue to uncover evidence of their lives. Excavations reveal pottery shards, garden plots, and remnants of cabins hidden deep in the swamp. Each artifact speaks to a people who refused bondage, who built a hidden world where freedom was lived, not just dreamed. These discoveries affirm what oral traditions have always maintained. The swamp was never empty, but alive with resistance. The legacy of the swamp also lives in African American culture. Songs, folktales, and oral histories carry echoes of ancestors who vanished into its depths. For the descendants of enslaved people, the swamp is not only geography, it is sacred ground, a reminder that freedom was claimed in defiance of chains long before emancipation. In a broader sense, the swamp forces us to rethink resistance. Not every rebellion came with muskets and fire. Some came in the form of silence, of endurance, of choosing to live free in places the world dismissed as unlivable. The Great Dismal Swamp redefines what it means to resist. Survival itself became revolution. Even today, the swamp whispers its story. Its cypress trees stand like sentinels, its waters still shifting, its silence heavy with memory. To walk its paths is to step into a history that was nearly erased, a history of hidden kingdoms, of families who dared to endure, and of people who turned a feared wilderness into a monument of freedom. The Great Dismal Swamp is not just a relic of the past, it is a mirror held up to the present, asking us, what does true freedom mean, and what are we willing to risk to protect it?